Hi, hello everyone. I see people trickling in, 72, 82. This is great. Thanks. My name's Brendan Stone. I'm with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. We organized a couple of demonstrations against the F-35, the fighter jet acquisition, and for Canada out of NATO just last month in January alone. Thanks for those who came out and publicized all that. There's a lot of great things happening. And that's what I want to thank everyone for coming to this very special event. I've personally noticed an uptick in interest in anti-war activity, both in Canada and in the United States. People want to get out of the serious danger that we are now in. So we have three excellent panelists for you who I can confidently tell you, if they had been listened to in the past, we would not be in this situation now. And you'll be hearing more about these panelists very shortly. By the way, I understand we have a chat window up and running now, Zoom chat. So to those who are joining us now, feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Now, Janine Solanki, she's a co-host today, and I'll be bringing you to her shortly. And I want you to know that I've been reading a lot of news websites, political commentary websites, and in the comments section, there's always a lot of chatter. And last month, people were asking, where is the anti-war movement? Remember the days of Iraq and all of that, Afghanistan? Where is the anti-war movement? And when people say that, sometimes a clever person says, no, it's all around you. It's all around it. You are the anti-war movement. Things are not going to happen in your community or around you until you start linking up with your friends and organizing things. So we want to give you background, understanding the conflict in Ukraine. How did we get into this situation? How can we get out of this situation? What was the role of NATO? What was the role of Canada? Our panelists today are going to tell you about those issues and more, especially in regards to peace building and getting out of nuclear confrontation. And so an event like today's, it requires, a network of people across the country to enhance and amplify the kinds of activity that we're doing. So in that context, I'd like to introduce you to Janine Solanki, a co-host today. She's going to tell you more about the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which is the main organization for today's event. So Janine, could you please tell us more about the CWPJN and its campaigns?
Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Janine Solanki, and I'm a Vancouver-based activist and organizer with Mobilization Against War and Occupation, which is a member group of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. I'm also on the editorial board of the Fire This Time newspaper, and have written extensively on US-led wars and occupations, which we'll be talking a bit about today. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Vancouver on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I know many of us are joining from across Canada and other parts of the world. So if you are residing on Indigenous territories, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the responsibility each of us have to Indigenous nations to recognize, respect, and support their historic and inalienable rights. As Brendan was saying, the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, which is organizing today's webinar, is a network that came together after the pandemic started in 2020 as a way to continue organizing against war across Canada. And we're made up of 45 organizations in addition to also individual members. In the last 2 years, we've come together on a number of very important campaigns, building cross-Canada united and coordinated actions, releasing statements together, sharing tools and knowledge, and working together across the country and also with other groups internationally. Of course, today we're talking about the No to NATO, Canada Out of NATO campaign, which the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network had a successful week of action last year around, and we're continuing today as we're coming up to a weekend of action, which we'll speak more about later in the program. But here in Canada, we're focused really on Canada's role in NATO, including supplying arms to Ukraine. to fuel this devastating war. So from there, also some of our important campaigns do focus on Canada and their role in stockpiling weapons of war, as well as producing and selling weapons of war to warmongering nations. This has included the campaign against new fighter jets, and protesting the recent announcement that Canada is buying 88 deadly, expensive, and environmentally harmful fighter jets, F-35 fighter jets. Also, we've been campaigning since we started, and really that was the first campaign that we got started with, against Canada arming Saudi Arabia. As we know, Yemen, the war in Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis today, after now going on 8 years of a Saudi-led, US-backed, and Canada-armed war. So we've been protesting against Canada funding and arming Saudi Arabia in this war. We've also more recently been protesting Canada's military exports that have reached Haiti. In October 2022, Canada and the US sent warplanes full of weapons and armored vehicles to Haiti. And just recently on January 11th, Canada sent another shipment supporting the imperialist-backed and unelected government. So we're supporting each other across Canada and coordinating together on these campaigns and many others. We've been protesting together on this new era of war and occupation that we've been seeing around the world. And I do want to mention, of course, protests against the Zionist Israeli occupation of Palestine that is ongoing and escalating today. Where I think a great example of how we can come together across the country and work together on broad demands and actions. And we'll be talking a bit more later about how you can get involved in the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network and the work that we're doing. I'll hand it back over to Brendan.
Sure, of course. You know, I'm seeing a lot of people introducing themselves in the chat, and that's great. And hi, Henry, I saw your message, thanks. And yes, some familiar faces, some unfamiliar faces, a lot like our panel. And you're going to have lots of opportunities to participate. I'm going to talk a little bit about that right now. This is a Zoom meeting. It is a webinar of sorts that we've arranged. And yes, you can put your questions in the chat to our panelists once they get going. And in fact, Maya and others are going to be going through the chat, going to be going through the comments, and we'll be amalgamating and sending and putting in lists these questions so that they will be asked. Janine and I will be reading them during the question period following the talks by the three panelists. So if you write questions in the chat throughout the meeting and afterwards, they will be collected, and hopefully we'll have time to read a lot of them in the question period that will follow the talks. And another small note, we are recording this event so that people can watch it who are not here right now. That does not mean you are being recorded. It's going to record the people who are on camera, the speakers and the organizers, the hosts, not so much the participants. So it's there shouldn't be any concerns. If you are concerned, you can leave the meeting. I don't recommend leaving because we're just about to get going. So I'm going to hand it over to Janine because she has also some accessibility notes on how to access the closed captioning that's happening during the event.
Yes, so if you would prefer to watch the event with closed captioning, you can go ahead and do that. We have the option in the Zoom. So as Brendan was saying, there is some various buttons near the bottom of your Zoom panel, and one of them will be a CC and also say live captions in the button. So you could click that to be able to view captions, and just please note that it is an automatic transcription by robots, not humans. So it will include errors, but will be maybe helpful to some of our participants today.
Well, great. Thank you, Janine. And as you all know, we have three featured panelists today, and their pictures are on the event advertisement, and they're going to be talking very shortly. And in fact, I'm going to be introducing our first panelist of the day, and that is Glenn Michalchuk. And he is the president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, and chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg. So as our first panelist, we're glad to have you, Glenn, and let's go over to Glenn.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be here today to have a very important discussion about this war and how we can end it. And it's very good to see the number of people that have joined into this conversation. I am participating in today's panel both as a peace activist and as a third-generation Ukrainian Canadian. In October of last year, I became national president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians, and I am also chair of Peace Alliance Winnipeg. And my remarks today are informed by my work in both of those organizations. I want to thank the organizers for today's panel, which will discuss what needs to be done against the escalation of the war and our aim to end it. Escalation of the conflict is making the prospect of peace more difficult and significantly increasing the danger that the war will become larger in scope to include direct confrontation between the United States and Russia. We know that such confrontation contains the risk of nuclear weapons being used. From the beginning of the conflict and in the months leading up to it, the official language of Western governments has been alarming, openly touting the possibility of all-out war against Russia. It seems each day we move closer to such confrontation. Just the other day, a spokesperson for the White House said that the US would not interfere in the decision of any NATO country to provide jet fighters to Ukraine. And just yesterday at the Munich conference, Vice President Harris announced that the US had determined that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. With such actions as this, the world is moving further away from the possibility to end this conflict. It is imperative that the movement against this war become more effective and determined to end it. Those who see this war as, quote, defending Ukraine are in fact contributing to its destruction. There is a real possibility that Ukraine will suffer the same fate Yugoslavia did as a result of that NATO war. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, I'm national president of the Association of United Ukrainian Canadians. So it's important to bring that perspective to this conversation, because often, at least in Canada, the opinions of Ukrainian Canadians through one organization in particular are used as a way to justify the war. So just let me give you some brief background into our association. The Association of United Ukrainian Canadians is the oldest mass secular organization of Ukrainians who came to Canada to start a new life. It was founded in 1918 as the Ukrainian Labor and Farmer Temple Association. Through its more than 100 years of work, it has faced persecution by the Canadian state for its political views, including its support for the Ukrainian nation from the 1920s through the period of the US-led Cold War. It has an unbroken record of progressive political, social, and cultural activity that has emphasized people-to-people friendship and striving for peace in the relations between countries. The founding and work of the AUUC predates by almost 50 years the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which self-describes itself as, quote, as the representative of all Ukrainian Canadians. So it is the Ukrainian Canadian Congress that has become the dominant voice in the media when it comes to so-called authoritative voice in response to the Russian invasion. This is not a surprise, since its views are in sync with those of the Canadian government and NATO. This alignment of purpose stretches well beyond the war of today. It is based on Cold War antagonisms and policies that give rise to these views. Thus, the UCC has advocated a NATO no-fly zone at the start of the conflict, and the provision of more and more weapons as the war has dragged on. Just recently, the UCC national president described Canada's recent provision of Leopard tanks as, quote, a game changer in the fight for the liberation of Ukrainian territories from brutal Russian occupation, end quote. The stance of the AUC has been for de-escalation of the conflict, ceasefire, and negotiations for peace. It is a position that I am confident will be proven to be on the right side of history, and one which really defends the interests of the people of Ukraine. I have said in many interviews that the war could have been averted. The Minsk agreements provided for a path to end the Cold War, to end the Civil War, and reunite the regions of Luhansk and Donetsk in the rest of Ukraine. This path was rejected both by the Western allies of Ukraine and the Zelensky government, despite the fact that Zelensky was elected on the promise of ending the civil war. The people of Ukraine did not want war and were deeply divided on plans to join NATO. They were also deeply divided on turning towards the European Union for their future. Once this war became a direct conflict between Russia and Ukraine, there was the possibility to end it through diplomacy, ceasefire, and peace negotiations. This is what the AUC urged at the outbreak of the war. These positions are not unique to the AUC. They are the positions that the majority of the world's nations have urged as a solution to end the conflict. The Minsk agreements were ratified by the UN Security Council. This panel is taking place in the same week that international actions will be held against the war. Our discussion today will be a contribution to developing the resistance to the Canadian US government's support for the war and the mainstream media who simply echo the NATO narrative. They have flogged this war as "Stand with Ukraine" to conceal that the war uses Ukraine as the battleground for the geopolitical objectives of the US and NATO against Russia. Stand with Ukraine for them means wage war through Ukraine. The war is now being pursued with fanatical fervor by Western governments. And as a Canadian of Ukrainian descent, I want to single out the Canadian government for its role in this, and Canadian politicians at every level of government who have not questioned what Canada is doing or what this means for the people of Ukraine. Yesterday, Canada's Defense Minister Anita Anand proudly tweeted, quote, "We're providing more and more military aid." Those who have questioned the war and advocated finding a solution to the conflict have faced persecution and retribution from a section of the Ukrainian community that has gone all out to fuel the war. They have labeled anyone who stands for peace as Russian propagandists. This was the situation in Ottawa when the Ukrainian Student Club at Carleton University branded a panel discussion titled, "The War in Ukraine, What is the Path to Peace?" as, quote, "a pro-Russian propaganda and disinformation event." Their attempts to deplatform the event were unsuccessful. The fanaticism for war is carried out on the backs of the ordinary Ukrainian people. According to estimates of the Ukrainian government, its army has lost at least 100,000 soldiers killed in this conflict. Millions of citizens have been displaced or fled Ukraine itself. This brutal war comes in addition to the 8 years of conflict between the Kiev government and the people of the Donbass region, which killed some 14,000 people and displaced over 1 million people who either fled into Ukraine, deeper into Ukraine, or Russia. The devastation caused by the civil war in the Donbass received scant attention in Western media. When it was reported on, it was described as inspired by Russian separatists. The actions of the Kiev government in the Donbass were supported without any reservation by the Canadian government. In fact, the Canadian government provided weapons, ammunition, and training to the Ukrainian army for it to conduct the civil war. It was through the 2014 US coup in Kiev and the civil war in the Donbass that the world began to learn of the influence of far-right groups in the Ukrainian government and the army. Right-wing nationalists roamed the streets of Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, attacking anyone who opposed their plans for Ukraine. The most well-known of these attacks was on the trade union building in Odessa and the burning alive of people who had taken refuge there. Is this a war in defense of Ukraine, or is it a war waged by others for their interests? It is true that on February 24th, 2022, the armed forces of Russia crossed the borders of Ukraine. But the reasons for this conflict predate February 24th, 2022. This is an important point that is obscured by those who want to continue to use Ukraine and its people as their proxy, or to delegitimize the calls for de-escalation, ceasefire, and negotiations. Certain facts are being established as this war drags on. The role of NATO and the fact that this war was planned well in advance are two that have become the focus of anti-war opposition. What may be less known is the Cold War ideology this war embodies. It is not possible to give a full picture of the influence of the Ukrainian right wing in Canada and Canadian political decision-making in a short space of time. However, its history and role is very well documented by Richard Sanders, and I would encourage you to check out his work. Internationally, it's also well documented in the Bandera Lobby blog. Two very good sources to check out. The main vehicle for political influence on the Canadian government is the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. The UCC is an organization that arose during the Cold War as the Canadian state took up the politics of the Cold War. Thus, the UCC and the Canadian state share the Cold War politics of the past and present. And of course, of special significance to the influence of the UCC is Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Not surprisingly then, the positions of the UCC on Russia and Ukraine have driven Canada's policy on Ukraine, regardless of which party is in power. Its reach extends to include all members of Parliament through the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group that, according to the UCC, has membership of over 100 MPs. During the Take Note debate of January 2022 in the Canadian Parliament, MPs were heavily lobbied by the UCC for a position of confrontation with Russia on the question of Ukraine. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland had already described the crisis in Ukraine as, quote, a battleground between democracy and autocracy. At a critical moment in the rising tensions between Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, Canada opted for escalation rather than finding a way to avert war. Positions in support of geopolitical confrontation are not new to the UCC, and they reinforce the international Cold War confrontation. A UCC 2019 policy paper titled Strengthening Canada-Ukraine Defense and Security Relations notes, quote, Ukraine is the front line of our defense against Kremlin aggression, and also called for removal of Russia from the SWIFT payments system and Ukraine's admission into NATO. The removal of Russia from SWIFT has now happened. The possibility of Ukraine's admission into NATO remains a central issue in the war. Internationally, the Ukrainian World Congress, based in Toronto, also has a record of militancy on the question of Ukraine. During the civil war in Donbass, it provided on its website a form letter for sending to members of parliament. The list of demands includes, and as I read them out, you might check them off. Providing Ukraine with military support, done. Accelerating NATO and EU membership, done. Increasing sanctions on Russia, done. And here's the shocking one. Stopping Nord Stream 2 from becoming operational. That too is done. Is this a war? Is this war in Ukraine being fought to achieve the interests of others? Yes, it is. In conclusion, this war could have been averted, and heavy responsibility lies on those who chose to escalate tensions to such a degree that war broke out. The longer the war continues, the greater will be the lasting impact on Ukraine from a human, environmental, and national perspective. The warmongers in Ottawa and Washington are either oblivious to this fact or it justifies their goals. To stand with Ukraine must mean to end the furtherance and continuation of this war. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for your really critical perspective. And I appreciate you joining with us here today. Before we go on to our next speaker, I know there are many events being planned across Canada and internationally for the Stop the War, Stop NATO International Weekend of Action, February 23rd to 26th, or other anti-war events. So I encourage people who have joined in, I know many from different anti-war organizations, to post your events in the chat so we can have more people joining in for our events across Canada and internationally. We're going to now go into our next speaker. I'd like to invite up Margaret Kimberly, who is the executive editor of Black Agenda Report and author of the book Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents. In addition to being a coordinating committee member of Black Alliance for Peace, she is also an administrative committee member of the United National Antiwar Coalition and the board of directors of the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. Margaret Kimberly is also a board member of Consortium News and is on the editorial board of the International Manifesto Group. So let's virtually welcome up Margaret Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. We all have to acknowledge that while what Russia calls its special military operation began 1 year ago this week, its origins began much earlier. There's another February anniversary to make note of, and that is the Munich Security Conference, which is held this month. At the 2007 conference, Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, said these words as part of his remarks, quote, "I think it is obvious that NATO expansion does not have any relation with the modernization of the alliance itself or with ensuring security in Europe. On the contrary, it represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust. And we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact? Where are those declarations today? No one even remembers them. But I will allow myself to remind this audience what was said. I would like to quote the speech of NATO General Secretary Mr. Werner in Brussels on May 17, 1990. He said at the time that the fact that we are ready not to place a NATO army outside of German territory gives the Soviet Union a firm security guarantee. Where are those guarantees, unquote. Russia continued asking for guarantees, and in the fall of 2020, made a formal request for talks and written guarantees to the Biden administration. This request was ignored for the simple reason that war is what the US wanted. Exactly 1 year ago today, I was joined by comrades in a protest at Grand Central Station in New York City. And I said the following. I said, quote, "This is a war of choice by the United States and by NATO, the true warmongers in this story. This crisis is entirely created by the United States to try to contain," I said that in quotes, "contain Russia, which is not possible and which threatens to cause a conflagration that will involve all of Europe and the whole world," unquote. I was writing a lot, as I'm sure many of us were, at this time last year. And around this time, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke in the US, predicting a Russian attack on Ukraine. But Ukraine was shelling the Donbass region that our previous speaker mentioned. And they were daring Russia to come in and protect that region. And they will then call Russia the aggressor. Provocation will be carried out by the US. We were all at this time last year waiting in anxious anticipation as the US instigated this war. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, was reporting increased Ukrainian attacks on Donbass. But several weeks earlier, President Biden made a strange remark about Russia. After months of predicting a Russian attack, he said a small incursion would not be serious. Quote, and so I think that you're going to see is that Russia will be held accountable if it invades. And it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not to, unquote. Biden let the cat out of the bag. You have to pay attention with some of his outbursts because he does inadvertently tell the truth. The Biden administration decided to act on a long-held dream of the US. They hoped to devastate Russia economically, turning the ruble to rubble, as Biden said. They wanted to sanction Russia's oil and gas and end its financial connection with European countries that had been purchasing its natural gas, and they wanted to kill the Nord Stream 2 project, as they said quite openly. Part of the reason was to make money for US companies and sell liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Europe. The damage done to European countries was a consideration in this way. They hoped to damage Russia's economy while also helping their own and make Europe more dependent on the US. The Biden administration sped up what had been US policy for 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union. While naive people like me at the time, while we hoped for a peace dividend, they immediately began encroaching upon what was now the Russian Federation. Despite promises to a very naive Mikhail Gorbachev that they wouldn't move NATO further east, they methodically began expanding NATO with former Warsaw Pact countries and even some former Soviet republics into what is supposed to be a defensive alliance. Of course, we know that isn't true. Even the name is a sham. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization claims the right to intervene all over the world. The South American nation of Colombia was declared a major non-NATO ally a few years ago. In 2011, NATO claimed that Libya was in its sphere of influence and bombed that nation under the responsibility to protect pretext and turned it into a failed state, which is the source of an ongoing immigration, humanitarian crisis, and even slavery. NATO recently announced that China, far from the North Atlantic, is a strategic priority, and they said Beijing's ambitions and its coercive policies challenge the Western Bloc's interests, security, and values. NATO is an offensive organization working to enhance imperialism carried out by what is now known as the collective West. This collective West poses a great danger to the world, but is also facing limitations on its power. Biden believed mistakenly in the old saying that Russia was just a gas station masquerading as a country. While the US raised energy prices for Europe and caused inflation, Russia turned elsewhere to China and India as energy customers. Kicking Russia out of the SWIFT payment system created great hardship for nations in Africa, for example, who were unable to pay for the grain and fertilizer they purchased from Russia. What they did not know, or rather chose to ignore, I think is more correct, is that Russia produces nearly everything that it needs and has products that are in global demand and are especially needed in Europe. Russia also has huge financial reserves. A sanctioned strategy against Russia was bound to fail. But none of that mattered to a group determined to exercise hegemony, regardless of the impact on people all over the world. Of course, hegemons don't really have friends, just vassals and enemies. I want to quote from the Black Alliance for Peace, another organization I'm involved in. And this is a quote from a statement we made last year. Quote, the Black Alliance for Peace emphatically declares that the conflict in Ukraine emerges from the ceaseless and single-minded drive of the US, NATO, and the European Union for global economic and political dominance. The genesis of this current crisis, as BAP has previously asserted, is in the 2014 US-backed coup of Ukraine's democratically elected government, and in the determination of the US, EU, NATO axis of domination to convert Ukraine into a heavily militarized NATO member nation, lurking on the border of the Russian Federation, unquote. And that crisis in 2014 began with European capital looking for profits, hoping to strip Ukraine of its assets. And when the president, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to go along with this scheme and instead turned to Russia, that is when this began. And it did not matter to the US that the coup government was made up of literal neo-Nazis and extremist white supremacists. But this isn't the first time. The US has always been flexible about this. After World War II, in the US, the CIA had, it was called Operation Paperclip, bringing Nazis to the US, including many scientists. The US space program was founded on the work of Wernher von Braun and other German rocket scientists. And the US has aided jihadists, as in Libya, as I mentioned, and is in Syria. So when the US wants to get something done, they don't care who helps them. And sometimes there are serious consequences. But let's be clear, NATO is the problem here. The US and its NATO allies have more than 800 bases and other facilities around the world. And closing them down is an essential part of ending NATO. As a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Antiwar Coalition, with those groups and others, we are part of the Closed Foreign Bases Coalition. The US has divided the world into command structures: NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, the Indo-Pacific Com, and the US Africa Command, AFRICOM. These facilities, these bases all over the world, deprive people of the input they should have in their own government and make mockery of claims of democracy. But some of this happens very close to home in Europe. One such example is in Ireland. Ireland is officially neutral and not a NATO member, but it supports NATO efforts through the Partnership for Peace program and the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, and allows the US to use its Shannon Airport as troops and materiel are transported to and from Western Asian nations. There are many activists in Ireland who are quite vocal in their opposition, but they are met with arrests and a determination by their state to silence them. Ireland is but one example of how NATO undoes the popular will in many countries. Lastly, we cannot discuss the issues of NATO and Ukraine without discussing recent revelations about the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. As I said, Joe Biden and his foreign policy team made many statements saying that they would stop Nord Stream 2. The US was the only logical perpetrator of the explosion that took place in last fall in 2022. And recently, Seymour Hersh, the well-known investigative reporter, wrote a 5,000-page article detailing how the deed was done. Hersh has many sources in the Defense Department, the CIA, and the State Department, who he's cultivated over many years. He broke the story of the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in 1969 and of the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Now he's being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, and major corporate media have ignored his latest reporting. I believe this to be proof of guilt. If the New York Times and the Washington Post and television networks thought that Hersh was a crackpot, they would dismiss him. But their silence is proof that they know he is right. The Biden administration is made up of fanatics, from the president on down, who fantasize about breaking up Russia or containing China, things that they will fail to do, but they will also create great dangers to the world in the process of failing. But the media and their mouthpieces The media are their mouthpieces, and the Ukraine project is completely bipartisan, and not one member of Congress from either the Republican or Democratic parties has said anything about what can only be called a terrorist attack on Nord Stream and on Germany, supposedly a US ally. It's clear that Russia is winning in Ukraine. NATO is literally scrounging the world for weapons. Ukraine is running out of weapons and out of people, as Ukrainians are literally being dragged off the street and out of their homes. They are forced into a few weeks of training and then are sent to the front to face superior Russian military might. We see Western leaders making increasingly bizarre claims as they struggle to deal with their favor and fall back on ever more shrill war propaganda. We must step up by joining together as we do today, by speaking, writing, joining in actions, and making demands on elected so-called leaders, because the world depends upon us, and that is no exaggeration. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Wow, it sounds like Margaret really came prepared for this meeting, and I'm sure she'll be very happy to answer your questions in the question period, as will the other panelists. By the way, it's great to see people having these reunions on the chat, peace activists from Canada and also the United States talking with one another, and the notices of events that are happening in the communities. That's why we're doing this. We want things to happen. We want events to happen in the community. You'll be hearing about that. So I'm glad people are posting that in the chat. And of course, you can post your questions, and you probably will have even more questions after you hear from our next panelist from Hamilton, actually. It is Kevin McKay. Now, Kevin is a professor at Mohawk College here. He researches, writes, and teaches on the subjects of civilization collapse, political transformation, and global systemic risk. In 2017, he published Radical Transformation, Oligarchy, Collapse, and the Crisis of Civilization with Between the Lines books. He is currently working on a book entitled A New Ecological Politics with Oregon State University Press. And Kevin also serves as vice president of the Mohawk Faculty Union, OPSU Local 240. So Kevin, thanks very much for joining us. Show your hands and your thumbs up and everything in the chat. And let's go over to Kevin McKay.
Thanks very much, Brandon. Thanks for the organizers, and thanks so much to Margaret and Glenn for their amazing talks. I'm going to have to modify mine slightly because some really important ground has been covered. What I want to do, folks, is I want to look at kind of the big picture in terms of how we can situate the conflict in Ukraine and also escalating tensions with China. And then I want to try and bring it back to what we as citizens of the collective West should and can do about these disturbing events. So I think it's clear to everyone now that we're witnessing a sweeping global geopolitical realignment, the movement from a unipolar to a multipolar world. The Ukraine war and escalating threats of war between China and the United States are symptoms of this tectonic shift. It's a time of cautious hope that the emerging multipolar world might eventually evolve into something that we could call a global democracy. However, it's also an incredibly dangerous time in which the declining US empire may very well trigger World War III instead of accepting a reduced role in the world. And so this unipolar situation that we're moving out of is basically the situation of US hegemony that they've enjoyed since around 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so there's been about 30 years in which the United States has had near uncontested dominance. And during this time, the US has intervened countless times in the politics of other nations, has launched wars of aggression against several states to further its imperial goals. And these goals are essentially to secure energy resources for itself and its allies, to keep energy resources from competitors, to open foreign markets for exploitation by US multinational corporations, and of course, to destabilize and destroy any competitors. And during this period of uncontested dominance, several countries and peoples have been crushed by American imperialism, such as in the Vietnam War, the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, the 2011 regime change war in Syria, which continues to this day. And many of the worst crimes of US imperialism happen closer to home in Latin America, considered under the Monroe Doctrine to be the sole sphere of influence of the United States. Since World War II, the US has supported right-wing coups, military dictatorships, terrorism, and genocidal wars against the indigenous population. American imperialism has also had horrendous effects in Africa. And in 2007, the US established AFRICOM to lead its military interventions on the continent, and they are many. It isn't just military might, though, that the US has used to solidify its power in the unipolar moment. Global energy and financial systems were also set up in its interests. This includes the petrodollar, in which Saudi Arabia agreed to only sell sell its oil in US dollars, leading to US currency to dominate foreign reserves around the world. The United Nations and the Bretton Woods systems of international organizations were also established, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. These institutions cemented US control over global politics and global finance. And through these institutions, the Washington Consensus of neoliberal capitalism was also promulgated, primarily benefiting US multinationals, but also large multinationals in other wealthy countries. And this goal towards global hegemony has been driven by a cabal of neoconservatives, US energy corporations, the military-industrial complex. And this group has been relentless in the pursuit of this unipolar American dominance. In 1997, the Project for a New American Century released a document which was basically about asserting full spectrum dominance, US military dominance over land, sea, air, and space. And so it's interesting to note that the United States today is the only country that has blatantly and publicly stated its desire and intention to dominate the planet. Now, obviously, during this time as well of uncontested dominance, the United States has also paid special attention to Russia and China, its main geopolitical rivals. And this can be seen in the fact that, as has been mentioned before, the United States has over 750 military bases outside of its borders worldwide. In contrast, China has only 8. And in the face of this encirclement, provocation, and aggression directed against them, Russia and China have weathered severe economic and political crises, but they have managed to stabilize themselves and once more become regional powers. And to this extent, they are guilty of the supreme crime, which is standing up to the unilateral exercise of American power. So instead of realizing that this unipolar moment I've just described is passing and that a multipolar world is emerging, in which Russia and China are regional powers, and the United States itself becomes a regional power, American neoconservatives are clinging to the dream of global hegemony. And this is the dangerous moment we now find ourselves in. The US empire is ending. There's no more debating this. The interest of people worldwide is for this transition to occur with a minimum of conflict. Of course, the danger is that delusional elements within the crumbling empire will attempt increasingly risky and potentially catastrophic gambits in order to cling to power. The ultimate risk, and mentioned by both previous speakers, is of a global thermonuclear war, which of course would be the end of civilization as we know it. So right now, the stakes simply couldn't be higher. Now, in terms of the war in Ukraine, again, as has been stated by the other speakers, we have to understand this completely within the context of American imperialism. To many in the collective West, Russia's invasion is a naked example of a war of aggression, a violation of international law. And there are grounds to make this argument. However, this perspective denies significant complexity, including claims to self-determination made by the peoples of Luhansk, Donetsk, and Crimea. Now, we may question the validity of the referenda held in these territories, but the history and ethnic makeup of the Donbass and Crimea, along with subsequent polling of the populace after independence, makes it clear that the majority of the population legitimately wanted to secede from Ukraine. And of course, we know instead of honoring the right to self-determination in 2014, the post-Maidan Kiev regime immediately attacked the people of Donbass, starting an 8-year civil war in which 14,000 people were killed, most of them innocent civilians. Now, again, one might argue that these crimes against international law do not justify a full-scale invasion. However, to suggest that Russia has no argument under law for its actions is simply not supported by any evidence. More importantly, though, the evolution of the situation in Ukraine, from the 2004 Orange Revolution to the 2013-2014 Euromaidan coup, to the funding and arming of Ukraine's military from 2014 through 2022, to the failed Minsk agreements. All of these moments have been driven by the United States and its NATO allies, working in close collaboration with far-right ultra-nationalist elements in Western Ukraine. The fingerprints of the United States are easily visible throughout this process, including billions of dollars in funding to anti-Russian politicians and movements, which Victoria Nuland bragged about. And the result was that ethnic tensions in Ukraine were cynically manipulated, and the country was turned into a weapon aimed directly at Russia. We now know from clear statements by Angela Merkel, Francois Hollande, Petro Poroshenko, and Volodymyr Zelensky that none of these leaders took the Minsk agreement seriously. None of them negotiated in good faith with Russia and the Donbass republics. We also know from Turkish sources and from the former Israeli prime minister that a peace agreement with considerable concessions from both Russia and Ukraine was all but concluded in March and April of 2022. Of course, we know it was the United States and the UK that prevented those talks from achieving their goals and for peace to be realized. You know, essentially the US and NATO wanted this war and they got it. Why did the US want conflict in Ukraine? I think this is an important question to ask. And I think there's several plausible reasons. First of all, NATO expansion in Europe was intended to keep Russia and Europe, especially Germany, from aligning, and instead to yoke Europe politically and economically to the United States. A second motive was to weaken and contain Russia, likely in a divide and rule strategy in preparation for a future conflict with China. There is evidence to suggest that the United States thought that the economic sanctions would force some sort of regime change within Russia. And of course, regime change has been openly talked about by senior US officials, including Joe Biden himself. Another motive is to disrupt the reliance on the reliance of Europe on Russian oil and gas, and to open up new markets for American oil and gas companies. And of course, this motive can clearly be seen in the sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. And finally, the conflict in Russia has been an unimaginable boon to Western military manufacturers, predominantly in the United States, but also in Europe. You know, the neocons have successfully remilitarized, or one would say maybe hyper-militarized the US economy, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. So the motives for this conflict are very clear, you know, from the US geopolitical perspective. From the perspective of military strategy, NATO expansion into Ukraine also enables military forces to be placed in close proximity to Russia. And when considering the unilateral withdrawal of the United States from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, NATO expansion enables the expansion of American nuclear capability to the very borders of Russia. This combines with US declarations of a nuclear first strike option and would completely destabilize the global balance of nuclear forces. So when Russia talks about this war and this conflict as being existential for them, this is the kind of thing that they're referring to. From a nuclear conflict perspective, this is an existential threat. And of course, the big problem we face in the collective West is that these other aspects of the narrative are completely missing. You know, the idea that the United States is an aggressive imperial power that projects its military force worldwide, that's missing from the context. You know, and equally missing is an understanding of the US role in creating, perpetuating, and escalating the conflict in Ukraine. You know, American journalist I.F. Stone remarked that all governments lie, and in times of war, this deception hits its apex. And it's clear that the governments of the collective West are engaging in deliberate, systematic misinformation in support of imperialism. You know, mainstream media is almost completely colonized by this imperialist narrative. It's helped extend the war by lying about the history and origins of the conflict, but also about lying of the progress of the war. You know, the steady destruction of Ukraine has instead been presented as a glorious victory for Ukraine. Corporate media invite us to engage in the most bizarre contortions of logic. Russia blew up its own pipeline. The Russian army is at once hopelessly inept, but also capable of invading and taking over the whole of Europe. The Putin regime and the Russian economy are on the brink of collapse, even though both are stronger than ever. In the face of this constant propaganda barrage, the liberal left seems to have been all but neutralized as a voice against imperialism. It seems to have lost its commitment to free speech, to dissent, to opposition to the war machine, and to a large extent, even opposition to class exploitation. The current fetishization of identity within Western left politics leaves capitalism and imperialism unchallenged. And I want to be really clear here. I'm not arguing for an either-or situation. Identity issues, intersectional oppressions, and equity are all incredibly important. However, if these goals are pursued without also confronting oligarchic capitalism and the war machine, then they constitute a dead-end politics. So instead of either or, we need a left politics of both and. We need to recenter the most destructive aspects of the global oligarchic system, capitalism and imperialism, and we need to unite in opposition to them. And there are many, many reasons why the left should oppose the Ukraine war. I mean, the left tends to be anti-authoritarian, which I think is a good thing. And wars like this, imperialist wars that are happening in Ukraine, only reinforce authoritarianism in the United States, in Russia, and China. In the US, wars like this enhance the power of the military-industrial complex. They lead to censorship and mass media propaganda, and they fatally skew national decision-making, especially around budget allocation. You know, over $100 billion can be given in weapons to Ukraine, while millions of Americans struggle with poverty, housing insecurity, unaffordable education, and a lack of healthcare. And, you know, we could look at the governments of Russia and China, and I think it's important to do so and say that they are authoritarian governments. But this kind of war, this kind of imperialist pressure by the United States only reinforces authoritarian tendencies in those countries, as well as spiking military spending in both of those countries. China and Russia are completely remilitarizing now due to this geopolitical conflict. And I think even if one's politics are more animated by identity issues, such as race, gender, or sexuality, it's important to realize that imperialism, war, and militarism are antithetical to these causes in all regards. They reinforce warlike masculinity, they denigrate alternative sexualities, and they divert resources from addressing social inequities. And so another important thing to understand is, of course, the US war machine and imperialism amounts to vast amounts of wealth being transferred from working people to oligarchs. You know, the Cost of War project in just this past January calculated that post 9/11 wars have cost $8 trillion to the American people. This money is paid in taxes by working people and then gifted to massive corporations. Arms manufacturers, private military contractors, energy corporations, tech corporations, all of them are beneficiaries. As of January of this year, US Congress has approved $113 billion in aid to Ukraine. And so this is about class as well. This is about the exploitation of working people to fuel massive corporations, to fuel this war machine. US imperialism also leads to the destruction of nations, and this is happening in Ukraine right now, and I think Glenn spoke to this very effectively. So even if you buy the entire narrative of the West, that Putin is some sort of bloodthirsty madman, that Russia is on a sort of neo-imperialist spree, look at what the West's support for Ukraine has actually done. Objectively speaking, if you could have had peace in 2015 with the Minsk Accords, you could have completely avoided this conflict, to today, where Ukraine is under dire circumstances. Its armies being annihilated on the battlefield. Over 18 million people have fled the country since February 24th, 2022, with over 8 million remaining outside the country today as refugees. Its economy has collapsed, and it now looks like it might lose up to 50% of its territory. So by any objective measure, Western policy in Ukraine has been incredibly destructive to Ukraine and to Ukrainians. Another important point I want to make is that US imperialism, war, and militarism are anathema to effective, coordinated global action on climate change and on the more fundamental challenge of widespread ecosystem collapse. You know, you can argue that the Ukraine war has set back the environmental movement 20 years. Countries are firing up coal plants. They're turning back to nuclear power. They're scrambling to secure fossil fuel sources. And also right-wing skepticism of the threats caused by climate change and ecological collapse is surging. You're seeing this all over the place. So the discourse questioning the validity of the climate crisis is proliferating. And so again, if you're an environmentalist and you're not also anti-war, you have to ask yourself, are you pursuing a dead-end politics? You know, if you're not going to confront the oligarchic system that exploits workers, that grinds up ecosystems for profit, and that devotes massive productive power to a people and planet-destroying war machine. So in order to confront this, to bring it back to what we can do as citizens citizens in the West. We need to be strategic in our organizing. We need to come together around issues where there is broad agreement. Opposition to the war machine, preservation of a livable planet for future generations, equality, justice, and fairness for working people, protection of substantive human rights for all peoples. And this means forming coalitions with actors and with organizations that we may have disagreements with, sometimes even serious disagreements. However, it doesn't mean that we pretend to agree on everything. We need to continue to argue for our vision of a just, humane, sustainable world, but we need to commit to laboring with those we disagree with, not simply burning bridges, canceling, and casting out those who we don't completely agree with. And this is a big challenge. Just to close, I know there's an event that's happening today as well in the United States, a really important anti-war demonstration. There's a lot of conflict around that, a lot of soul searching on behalf of a lot of activists as to whether they should support an anti-war event in which they don't agree with the positions of all the speakers or all the different groups that are involved. I think we have to be very, very careful about this. And in moments such as this, we need to come together around the 70 or 80% that we agree on. And again, keep disagreeing on the rest. I'm not trying to say that those differences need to go away or should go away, but we really have to start prioritizing our opposition to war. The last thing I'll say is, as a Canadian as well, this opposition to war means opposing Canada's continuation in NATO. Canada needs to get out of NATO. And I think all NATO countries need to have similar movements in terms of getting out of an alliance that, if it was ever defensive in the past, it certainly hasn't been for about the past 20 years. It's incredibly destructive. Its time is up. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. And I think the important message there that you ended off on is unity, and that's been an important part of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. As I said earlier, we're 45 organizations across Canada, anti-war, social justice, and peace organizations that have come together from many different organizations that are uniting on our common demands. So I'd like to now pass over the virtual mic to Ken Stone to give us a bit of an update of actions coming up for the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. Ken Stone is a longtime anti-war, trade union, social justice, and anti-racism and environmental activist, and is representing the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, which is a member of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. Ken, are you on there?
I'm here. Thanks, Janine. On behalf of the steering committee of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, I'd like to invite everyone on this call to join our Canada-wide Weekend of Action next weekend, February 23rd to 26th, to stop the war in Ukraine and to stop NATO and to get Canada out of NATO. So far, 8 actions are planned across the country: Regina, Vancouver, Victoria, Montreal, Calgary, Hamilton, Ottawa, and Waterloo. And we expect more. Please go to the website where you will find, at the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network, a list of all the actions and the demands and a toolbox for creating one of your own in the event that you're in a city where there isn't already a posted action. And a posted action doesn't have to be complicated. You can make up a sign yourself, hold it, take a selfie, hold it in front of you, and use that sign to post it onto, share it on Facebook and Twitter and other social media, saying where you're from. You could take that same sign and go stand out in front of your MP's office and take a selfie there. Or you could get a few friends together, consult us, issue a media release, and become an action in a city. So we want to send a message to Trudeau that there is an alternative to his policies. But more important, we want to send a message to Canadians that there is a movement in this country that provides an alternative to the dominant narrative of the government and mainstream media. Brothers and sisters, the stakes could not be higher. As other speakers have pointed out, this war in Ukraine could easily morph into a regional war in Europe, or even a nuclear confrontation between the great powers. It's already a war on the environment, as others have pointed out, with the US sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline having released the largest amount of methane in world history. So there's a lot at stake, and I urge you to join with us next weekend, February 23rd to 26th, in a Canada-wide weekend of action to stop the war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. And just continuing from what Ken was saying, I want to again encourage people, if you have events part of those weekend of action, the weekend of action, or other anti-war events, please feel free to put them in the chat. I will also let you know about another campaign that the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network has taken on, which is against the brutal US-led, Canada-armed, Saudi-led war on Yemen. We're coming up to 8 years of the war on Yemen on March 26, 2023, coming up very soon. And Canada is still exporting billions of dollars of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And we in the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network have consistently demanded that Canada stop arming Saudi and an end to the war on Yemen. So there will be some days of action marking the 8-year anniversary, March 25th and 26th. And I'll put some more info in the chat regarding that. Before I just hand it over to Brendan to get us started with the questions and answers, I will quickly reiterate a few of the announcements that were in the chat. Anyone that's in the Victoria or Vancouver area, if you'd like to take a ferry, there are peace groups in Victoria, BC, joining for the United for Old Growth March and Rally on February 25th at 12 noon in Centennial Square with the message, nature, not NATO, forests, not F-35s. There is also, looking a little bit internationally, a national march on Washington demanding peace in Ukraine, stop NATO, protesting on the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq. So that will be Saturday, March 18th. At 1 p.m. in Washington, D.C. at the White House, and I'll post more info on that in the chat too. And as Ken said, our weekend of action next weekend across Canada will kick off in Ottawa on February 23rd, in Vancouver on February 24th with a rally and leafleting, in Winnipeg with an informational picket on February 25th, in Regina, also on February 25th, and Montreal on February 25th, and Calgary City Hall on February 25th. So February 25th will be a very busy day across Canada. Hamilton will be having a virtual panel discussion, so everyone can participate in that on February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern. So I'll count on the Hamilton folks for posting that in the chat. And then Waterloo will round out the weekend on Sunday, February 26th at 1 p.m. So again, the link is in the chat to the weekend of action, and I encourage people to check that out and join in actions close to you. Brendan, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, and thanks for pointing all of that out, Janine. Very important stuff. Yes, Yemen. You might be hearing more about that coming out of Hamilton later in the year as well. So keep your eyes open. We're expecting to do something in May about Yemen. And yes, we have a panel webinar on the 25th. You can find out about that on the website. So yes, please, people, keep posting your event announcements in the chat. We're all very excited to learn just about how much really is going on now. Now, you know you have a good event when you have great questions. And we have great questions, informed and intelligent questions from the audience, from the guests here. So I'm very glad that I'm going to be able to go through that with Janine. I think we'll alternate Janine and I asking questions that we saw in the chat and being collected by Maya. And I'll just start chronologically with the first one I saw. That one's from Tamara, actually, and it seems to be a general question, open question for the panelists. It is, how can we influence the government and other political parties? How can we build peace with Russia and China? How can we overcome the Russia and China bashing and misinformation. So I'll leave that open to our panel.
I'd like to start, if I may. I don't know if I was supposed to raise a hand or what, but at any rate, I'll follow whatever etiquette. I'm starting to think that we cannot influence our political leadership as much as let them know that we're making demands upon them. Here in the US, and I suppose around the world, the greatest change has come when people make demands that they know their leadership don't want to meet and make the demands anyway. These people are, even in supposedly democratic nations, they're bought off. I don't know how else to put it. The military-industrial complex, they give money to our politicians. We have phony progressives here in the United States who, say all the right things until you need them to do something. So I don't know if we can influence them as much as engage in mass action and just let them know that, and create a political crisis, as my late mentor used to say. All the great movements create a political crisis and force them to do what the people want them to do. So I think the question for us is, how do we as people join together? What degree of willingness do we have to take action? I often wonder about here in the US, the right wing is like January 6th, and I'm not saying we have to do the same thing, but if we get 50 people together, we're happy. And we have to just own it. We have to acknowledge that it's going to take radical action on our part, a mass movement. I've seen them, and I'm old enough to have seen them. I experienced what's called the civil rights movement in the US, the environmental movement. Millions of people came out, millions. That's why we have an Environmental Protection Agency that a conservative president, Nixon, put into place. So that is my take on how we can supposedly influence these people who have made themselves immune from being influenced. They have to hear from us, and we have to act as though this is an emergency, because it is. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. Oh, sorry, Kevin, did you want to answer to that too?
Yeah, if I could. I mean, I agree with everything
Margaret
said. I think in the case of something like the war machine, just like if you're talking about war or capitalism, if you're talking about these structures that are so deeply invested in by the elite, it's true, we're not going to convince the elite to stop these activities. I think that there's some grounds, if people are able to work within a political party, even on the level of policy, on the level of getting grassroots candidates, put up for election, that's great. But I agree with Margaret in the sense that I think that it always takes a movement to create change this fundamental. And so that's really, I think, where organizing is very productive. I know that any institutions we're a part of is an immediate place where we can wage this struggle. So just to give you an example, I'm a member of the labor movement in Canada. And so it's all about, has your union local passed a resolution on this? Has your labor council passed a resolution on this? Is the Ontario Federation of Labor passed a resolution? Is the Canadian Federation of Labor? To try and use what platforms we do have to get the message out. We are combating a really thick veil of propaganda. We're combating decades and decades of anti-Russian racism, really just ridiculous things. I mean, now Alexander Ovechkin is under attack in the National Hockey League. It's we have a lot to push back on, but I think that using our immediate social connections is really important. The conversations we're having in our workplaces, the conversations we're having in the institutions that we're a part of are very, very important. The last thing I'll say too is I do think that we need to be visible. And I know this is a challenge when we do feel maybe sometimes small and weak, or maybe not weak, but small in numbers. I think we have to get out and be visible anyway, because I think we're all familiar that if you do that, you then create space and permission for other people to do the same. And you validate feelings they might have about they don't think this Western narrative on Ukraine adds up, and you give them the opportunity to also speak out with you and maybe come out and support actions and whatnot. So yeah, I think movement building is very important, being visible is important, and using our institutional connections, very important.
Great, thank you, Margaret and Kevin. Excuse me. And I just wanted to say there are quite a few questions, so we'll try our best to get to all of the questions in a limited time. But I apologize in advance if we don't cover all of them. I did want to say that we have a statement from the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network for the weekend of action, the No to NATO, No to War action, weekend of action coming up. So I'll be posting that in the chat. Our next question is from Atif, which is, to what extent is this a war against China? The support of Ukraine war by NATO is setting an example of what should China expect from NATO. The war has many serious impacts on the global south, but these are ignored. So does any one of our speakers want to address that question? Go ahead, Glenn.
I think the concern that the war in Ukraine has raised for anybody is this this is part of the whole strategy of the Western powers to also contain China. So it's while it's directed in this case directly against Russia, I mean, it shows the politics of the situation, as the West is also these same Western governments which a year ago were raising the alarm that something had to be done to stop Russia, are now raising this in the same period have been raising this alarm about China. And I think it gets to some of the points made by Kevin just on the last question, that there's this whole history of Cold War politics. I mean, Russia and China become very easy countries to just pick and demonize because of the anti-communism in society, the whole history of the Cold War. So it is of concern, and it means that our work as activists in the peace movement has to be to mobilize on this question as well, and to prevent these kinds of actions, these hysteria against China from being part of the narrative too. And it all the same problems and hurdles that the anti-war movement and peace movement have been facing on the question of Ukraine, we face the same problems and hurdles on the question of China. But just to give an example, how you fight these things, in a very immediate space. 2 weeks ago or so, there was this proposition that Winnipeg City Council was going to entertain an anti-China motion on the question of human rights and fair trade. And so at least some of us went down and actually spoke against the motion, and there was no interest on the part of City Council to engage in this kind of thing. So the motion died. But it was important to go there and to raise these questions as to why, what are the objectives of these motions? Are there any basis in facts for them? So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Glenn.
I wouldn't mind jumping in really quickly on that, Brendan, if I could.
Sure.
I just think they're completely connected. And I think it's very important that we speak of them in that sense, in the sense of the Ukraine conflict and the escalating tensions with China, completely connected. They're part of the same process. They're part of this same desperate attempt to preserve hegemony in the face of changing realities, right? And I just think one of the things we need to do is help people connect those dots and help them understand that the real problem here is U.S. imperialism. The real problem here is a dying empire that is not, or that is going through the difficult transition in which a certain segment of the elite within the U.S. Is still delusional. They still don't think that empire is going to fall apart. They're still looking to contain China. China can't be contained. I mean, anyone with any sense of what's going on in the world could see that. Even Russia, clearly, the United States drastically underestimated. They've been preparing for 10 years for this war, right? So I think that we have to get people to understand that big picture and understand that we're the ones in the collective West that have to back off, that have to learn to live within our means globally, economically, ecologically, you name it, you know. I know that's a difficult message for people to hear, but I just think that is really important so that we understand that the root cause of China, Russia, people brought up Yemen, people brought up, you know, Palestine, all these other things. The root cause really is Western imperialism, you know. So how do we get that message out?
Well, on that note, Kevin, I should probably go to the next question, which is about that. It's from Amrit, and it's, how do we make clear that it's US imperialism that is the primary contradiction here? I'm seeing way too many anti-imperialists in the West call China and Russia imperial or colonial, and these same deflections are also coming from US State Department think tanks, where they openly talk about balkanizing Russia and China in the name of so-called decolonization. So does anyone want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would like to. I would have to say, we can't let everybody call themselves an anti-imperialist. Anyone who talks about, uses this ginned up term, decolonizing Russia, anyone who spends their time calling these two nations imperialist is not an anti-imperialist. And we need to just say it. Now, I have to say, in both countries have made what you can call errors. Both countries have made decisions that I do not agree with, that I think have been very harmful to their people and to the world. But they're not imperialist. The imperialist nation is the one with the currency hegemony, with 800 bases around the world, that controls the United Nations, that controls NATO. That is the imperialist nation. So even in our critiques of Russia and China, we have to make clear the degree of harm that's being done by each nation. And we can't let everybody call themselves left. We can't let everybody call themselves an anti-imperialist, because if you're talking about decolonizing Russia or breaking up Russia, you're not an anti-imperialist. I don't know what the hell you are, but that isn't it. So I want to be clear. I think we have to be very outspoken about this. We can't tiptoe around people. This is a very dangerous juncture in history, and we have to amplify and lift up those people who really are anti-imperialist and name the enemy, name the perpetrator of this crisis and many others. You know, the US is trying to turn Taiwan into the next Ukraine. That is the imperial country, having had Ukraine blow up in their faces, having gotten nothing that they hoped they would get. Their goal is to turn to China and try to do the same thing. So unless you're willing to say those things, I would say that those folks are not anti-imperialist, not at all. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think those were some great responses. Kevin, did you want to add to that?
Just really quickly, you know, I couldn't agree more with what Margaret just said there. But one of the things that I was thinking of too, which helps maybe, or which would help us in making this case, is we do have to be honest about the fact too that this is my personal thought. Other people might disagree with me. Russia and China are big, powerful countries. They exert their power outside of their borders. When I talk about war and imperialism, I'm not trying to pretend that Russia and China are somehow pure moral actors on the world stage. They're not. I just don't think that's a serious way of looking at the world. So we can be critical of these governments. We should be critical of any government, of every government, right? However, the point, I think that's the common point that's been made, is it's simply not, there's no evidence that either of those other countries have been trying to exert global dominance, military dominance, exerting their power throughout the planet. I mean, it's not even close, right? And so, but I think sometimes we can get in trouble, you know, where, and we've seen this way back in the anti-war movement, where if you're, for instance, opposing a war in Iraq, well, you're a Saddam lover, right? It's a real sort of facile thing that's thrown in your face, right? Or you're a Putin lover if you're supporting Russia or whatnot. I personally am not a fan of the politics of Vladimir Putin. I'm personally not a fan of the authoritarian tendencies in the Chinese government. However, I 100% would agree that they're not imperialist nations. They're nations that are trying to chart their own course within the world today. And every nation should be allowed to do that. I would like to see a world eventually in which all powerful countries are hemmed in by international law fairly and evenly and justly applied. Like that's kind of what I think global democracy would be. We're not there yet. So I think that we can be critical of these other countries while also recentering on just what the facts show. The facts show that it is the United States which is pushing this agenda for global domination. And that's the most dangerous thing we're facing in the world today, by far.
So thank you very much. And I will just say we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but I think looking at the questions, many of those have been answered through the responses of our speakers, our fantastic speakers today. So maybe if they weren't directly asked, they were also answered. I want to group together a couple of last questions before we wrap up for today. Unfortunately, we don't have time to keep going for too much longer, but I think the last few questions lead us into a bit more of what we can do next and how we can keep this fantastic education that we've had in the last hour and a half going beyond everyone at this webinar. So Chrissy was asking about sharing trusted sources for news on the issue and what trusted media we can look to for unbiased reports. And Sarah was asking along the same lines, talking to people who say that they're that perhaps NATO and the US do bad things and are corrupt, but they have been influenced by the propaganda against Russia and are looking for resources that that we can share with those people to say just how harmful the US and NATO have been and share with especially newer people to the topic. And then also from those two questions, I want to also ask the question from Henry. With all the focus leveled on Ukraine, people are losing sight on what is happening in areas of the world such as Palestine, Yemen, and Kashmir. How do we bring focus back to the greater global issue? And I think I'll just add, you know, we saw some very, very racist commentary in news reports, especially at the beginning of this war. And it's true that there are wars going on all around the world that are not getting this kind of media attention. So I'll pass it over to our speakers for those last three questions and any closing comments.
I'll be very quick. You should read blackagendareport.com. We're the best news source ever. On Wednesday, Black Agenda Report, we have articles, a commentary. On Friday, we have Black Agenda Radio, where I interview people doing a variety of things. So that's my answer. Thank you.
My recommendation would be that there's a very good website called New Cold War, which covers all these issues about many of these countries. It's a very good website. Then there are some more specific sources that deal with specific regions of the world, such as Resume, a South American publication, a Latin American publication that deals with the politics in Latin America. So those are two that come to my mind.
I would suggest there's a great podcast called The Left Lens by Danny Haifong, and I think he does some really great work. There's also, I mean, The Gray Zone, right? I mean, you know, some people might find him a little bit controversial, but I think there's amazing, especially Aaron Mate, some incredible reporting that takes place there. Again, I think, you know, the Duran, I maybe don't share all the politics of the folks involved, but for geopolitical analysis, they're incredible. They're on point. And I think that's another good program as well. So Chris Hedges is good on this issue. You know, Jeffrey Sachs is good on this issue. It may seem funny to say it, but Russell Brand is good on this issue. There's a lot of voices out there that I think are really the New Atlas. Thanks, Ken, for that. Brian Berletic, his channel as well. So there are some really good sources that are out there. And the very last thing I'll say, just as a closing remark, is I really think that one of the things we need to try and do a little bit better, and this will help us in terms of building movement as we go forward, is bringing the effects of war and imperialism home to the people who live here, in the sense of we know that the sanctions are backfiring, right? I mean, definitely backfiring in Europe, but they're also having an effect in North America as well. You know, we're seeing massive amounts of money not being spent on the priorities that matter most to us as working people. And I think that to the extent that we can really help people appreciate that this horrendous waste of productive capacity and lives and technology and machinery, that this waste on war takes away from our most immediate priorities for good jobs, for healthcare, for education, for a clean, livable environment, for all of these things that we really care about. That's something that I'm trying to get better at doing, is making that connection for people, that this isn't some abstract thing just because it's another country getting brutalized, which unfortunately in North America it usually is another country that's getting brutalized. Just because it doesn't, we don't think it touches us, it does touch us. It warps our entire society. It warps our priorities. It takes away from these other movements. And, you know, hopefully we can get better at trying to convey that, and then maybe getting people more involved.
Wow, fantastic. So I think that there was a lot of great sources there and posted in the chat. So I thank everyone for that. Brendan, do you have any other closing words?
I just think this was an absolutely amazing webinar panel. What people had to say should be taken down, at least for posterity, for future historians, if there are any, because I know it's a cliche, but this is one of the clearest expressions of the discussions that are happening that I have seen in the duration of this conflict. We're going to put up the video on our website, distribute it to our email lists. We're really proud of the panelists and the organizers and the people who came out to ask questions. I want to thank you all. Be sure to spread this event with your friends once we get the links up to where it's posted. I think this is amazing, and every Canadian should be hearing this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, everyone, for joining in today. As Brendan said, make sure to share out the video from today's event. I encourage you all to make sure that more people see this webinar today. We had great participation across Canada and internationally, and this video can continue being shared around the world. So thank you again to our fantastic speakers who shared their words and experience with us today. And thank you, everyone, for joining in.
Thank you.
Thank you
for inviting me. Peace.
Thank you. Yes.